Glad you're here for Unintended Consequences, episode 74 for July 30th, 2026. Today's profile, a policy that did the opposite of what its designers intended. In 1943, New York City froze rents on hundreds of thousands of apartments under wartime emergency rules. The measure aimed to prevent landlords from exploiting families whose breadwinners were overseas. Within a decade, some buildings began to show visible neglect, with peeling paint, unrepaired boilers, and slow conversions to commercial use. New rental construction in the city fell sharply relative to uncontrolled suburbs. The policy that began as temporary protection had started to change the very stock of housing it was meant to preserve. Policymakers in the 1940s faced genuine rent shocks. Wartime migration and material shortages had driven sharp increases in many cities, and returning veterans needed stable places to live. In New York, officials extended the federal price controls into local law because they saw housing as a necessity whose price should not be left to short-term scarcity. Similar logic appeared in Stockholm after 1942 and in San Francisco after the 1978 property tax revolt. Elected leaders believed that capping rents would prevent displacement of existing residents without requiring new public construction. At the time, the main data available were vacancy rates and eviction notices. Few longitudinal studies tracked how landlords would respond to sustained price ceilings. The measures therefore looked like straightforward equity tools that were temporary, targeted, and reversible once supply normalized. What made the approach feel workable was the arithmetic visible in the moment. A landlord's revenue came from monthly rents, while major costs such as roof replacement or boiler overhaul arrived irregularly but in large lumps. If rents could be held steady for sitting tenants until new construction caught up, the thinking went the immediate hardship of doubled rents would be avoided and the market would later rebalance. Few records from the period show officials modeling how many years that rebalancing might take or how the same revenue cap would affect decisions about whether to keep a building in the rental stock at all. New York's system began with the 1947 rent control law and was later supplemented by the 1969 rent stabilization law covering newer buildings. San Francisco voters approved the Residential Rent Stabilization and Arbitration Ordinance in June 1979. Limiting annual increases to a formula tied to inflation. Stockholm's municipal housing companies maintained strict queue-based allocation under national rent guidelines that dated to the 1940s and were tightened in the 1960s. Early reports in each city noted lower turnover and fewer visible evictions. Proponents pointed to stable rents for sitting tenants. Skeptics, including some housing economists at the time, warned that maintenance would suffer and that new private construction would shift elsewhere. By the mid-1980s, all three jurisdictions had layered additional rules such as eviction protections, pass-through allowances for capital improvements, and exemptions for small buildings. Yet the core price caps remained. Landlords facing caped revenue had clear incentives to reduce operating costs or exit the rental market. In New York, thousands of units were converted to cooperatives or condominiums during the 1970s and 1980s. Others were left vacant or warehoused. San Francisco data later showed that rent-controlled buildings experienced higher rates of condo conversion and demolition after the 1990s. Stockholm's system produced queues that stretched 10 to 20 years for desirable central apartments, prompting subletting markets and cash payments to existing tenants. Because controlled units turned over less often, newcomers and younger households faced tighter effective supply. Long tenure residents captured most of the benefit. New construction slowed in tightly controlled segments of each city as developers shifted toward owner-occupied or luxury product where price limits did not apply. Maintenance spending per unit declined in older stock, visible in higher complaint rates and in some studies, faster physical deterioration. These effects compounded, with lower mobility reducing labor market flexibility, while the scarcity signal that might have spurred new building was muted. Second-order responses included tenant buyouts in San Francisco and informal side payments in Stockholm, both of which transferred value outside the regulated price. By most accounts, the policies reallocated existing units rather than expanding the total stock. One way to see the mechanism is to follow the money on a single building. Suppose a 20-unit rent-controlled property generates $180,000 a year after the cap. A new roof costs $120,000 and lasts 25 years. A new boiler runs $60,000. When revenue cannot rise to cover those outlays without lengthy approval, the owner faces a choice to defer the work and risk code violations, sell to a buyer who will convert the building, or stop offering units for rent altogether. Even where laws required minimum maintenance, the enforcement margin was imperfect. Inspectors could cite visible problems, but they could not force an owner to keep marginal units in the rental pool rather than converting them. The result was not uniform decay, but selective withdrawal. Units whose repair costs exceeded the present value of caped rents were the first to leave the market. A common objection is that some landlords would maintain properties out of pride or long-term asset value. That motive existed, yet it operated against the arithmetic that any capital tied up in a controlled building earned a lower return than the same capital deployed in uncontrolled housing or other uses. Over decades, the differential compounded. Developers responded by building fewer apartments in the controlled segment and more condominiums or suburban single-family homes, shifting the composition of new supply even when total regional construction remained steady. Cities responded with incremental adjustments rather than wholesale repeal. New York added vacancy decontrol provisions in 1997 and again in 2019, then reversed some of those changes. San Francisco expanded coverage to smaller buildings and later imposed new restrictions on condo conversions. Stockholm has experimented with limited market rent pilots for new construction while preserving the core queue system. None of the jurisdictions returned to fully unregulated private rental markets. Recent empirical work, including a 2019 Stanford study of San Francisco, quantified reduced rental stock and misallocation. Similar patterns appear in Swedish and New York analyses. The policies remain popular with current tenants, so reforms tend to target new supply incentives, such as tax credits and zoning changes, rather than direct price cap removal. Price ceilings on existing goods tend to reallocate scarcity rather than eliminate it, because they do not automatically increase the quantity supplied. When rules favor sitting tenants, mobility and turnover become additional margins of adjustment that can disadvantage newer entrants. Complex urban systems respond to price signals through multiple channels, including maintenance, conversion, and new construction. Single variable interventions often produce offsetting behavior elsewhere. The practical question today is whether any proposed cap on housing costs is paired with credible measures to expand supply. Without that pairing, the historical pattern suggests the ceiling will continue to shape the floor. What supply-side measures would you watch most closely in a city considering new rent caps right now? And that's where today's story leaves us. If it changed how you see one everyday decision, that's the whole point. Pass it along to someone who'd appreciate it, and we'll be back tomorrow with another case. And if you'd rather watch than listen, find us on YouTube at NARA Network. Links in the show notes. This show comes to you from the NARA Network. If you want another sharp daily briefing, SpaceX Daily has you covered. The daily companion for following SpaceX as a public company, from Starship to the stock ticker. All our shows are free at neranetwork.com. Prefer reading? Today's full write-up, sources, and transcript are on the episode blog at neranetwork.com. Same briefing, readable format. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.